The Shortcomings of Pascal's Wager by Michael Chiango. The belief in gods is a facet of human nature that is endemic throughout human history. One would be hard-pressed to find many openly atheist thinkers who lived more than a few hundred years ago. Yet, as common as this belief is, over the course of history it became more and more difficult for intellectuals to simply take it as a given that God or gods did in fact exist, as scientific discoveries and philosophical inquiries seem to be pushing God out of the realm of practical necessity. Thus, theistic philosophers came up with all manner of arguments to defend their belief, such as the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the argument from design, and the divine command argument, all of which have been the subject of much critique and are lacking in many ways. Blaise Pascal was a French mathematician, physicist, and philosopher who lived from 1623 to 1662, who developed his own justification for his belief in God. However, unlike most other philosophical arguments for the belief in God, Blaise Pascal did not attempt to put forth any arguments for God's existence. Instead, Pascal's wager, as it is referred to, argues that regardless of God's actual existence or non-existence, it is still in people's best interest to believe in him. Essentially, Pascal was not concerned about truth, but about consequences. The basic, well-known form of Pascal's justification goes as such. 1. Either God exists or God does not exist. 2. If God exists and you believe in him, you stand to gain an eternity of blissful existence in heaven, while if you disbelieve in him, you will be punished with an eternity of agony in hell. 3. If God does not exist, you stand to lose little by believing in him, and you stand to gain little if you don't believe in him. 4. Therefore, even if there is only a small chance that God exists, you are still much better off believing. This is because even if God does not exist, and you are better off in your mortal existence disbelieving in God, your reward for disbelief is only finite compared to your infinite reward or infinite punishment if God does exist. It is essentially like an infinite lottery. No matter how small the chances are of you winning, it is still a good deal because the finite cost is nothing compared to the infinite reward. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal was trying to argue that no matter how low the probability of God's existence was, rationality still required us to roll the dice and take a chance. But is this argument truly rational? It may seem sensible on the surface, but when one probes just a little deeper, Pascal's wager contains just as many holes in it as do arguments for God's existence. The first premise of the argument, either God exists or God does not exist, is wrong for one thing. Pascal is incorrectly assuming that there are only two options, which makes sense, because he lived in a heavily Christian society where it was generally assumed that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was the one true God. And yet, Muslims believe that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob punishes Christians with eternal torment in Gehenna and rewards Muslims with an eternity of bliss in the garden. Even if Pascal believed in God and God did actually exist, there is still a chance he would miss out on his eternal reward and suffer eternal torture instead if that God had Muhammad as his prophet. And even if the Christian God was the correct version, there would still be no assurance for Pascal that his belief in God would pay off, because he would also have to choose between the different denominations of Christianity. There are Catholics who believe Protestants will burn in hell, there are Protestants who believe Catholics will burn in hell, and there are fundamentalists who believe most Christians will burn in hell for not worshiping God in the right way. With just one God and his different interpretations, Pascal's false dichotomy of God or no God has been completely shattered. In reality, though, there are countless gods produced from the myriad of religions that have existed throughout history, of which Pascal must choose between, many of which carry their own punishments and reward for belief and disbelief. But things get even worse for Pascal from there on. Even if it is taken as a given that God does exist, all the religions of earth cannot all be true. And so, if most religions and gods worshipped on earth are false, who is to say that all of them aren't false? Human minds are finite, but if God does exist, the possibilities for what he, she, they are like are infinite, and thus, rather than the duality Pascal presented in his first premise, he is instead presented with an infinite number of choices, an infinite number of which would promise eternal torment for disbelief and eternal bliss for belief. Perhaps the great Ducky Momo in the sky who created the universe would send Pascal to hell to burn for eternity for daring to decline from buying his merchandise. Now faced with this dilemma, Pascal might argue that the existence of the great Ducky Momo in the sky is highly unlikely, and one should instead place their bets on the most likely deity to exist, which Pascal thought was Yahweh. But according to Pascal's own argument, no matter how unlikely the chances are of existence, since the reward is infinite, it is worth it to believe. On top of that, the claim that Yahweh is the deity that is the most likely out of all the possibilities to exist is a contentious one at best. A cursory glance at the Christian Holy Book will reveal all manner of historical and scientific inaccuracies, contradictions, and moral debaucheries that scream man-made, rather than inspired by the omnipotent creator of the universe. To many, if God does exist, a deistic non-interventionist God is a much more likely option. The first premise of Pascal's argument is valid only under the egregious assumption that it is only possible for God to exist in one type of way, and can only demand one type of worship. The problem of the infinite possibilities of gods is also a problem for Christian philosophers trying to prove their God's existence with arguments like the ontological and divine command, since those arguments only argue for a God and not the Christian God. But in the case of those arguments, they are not necessarily arguing for the Christian God, and thus the infinite possibilities for God does not disprove those arguments for God's existence. In Pascal's case, the infinite possibility for God is far worse because he is not arguing for God's existence, but merely for the belief in a specific God, failing to acknowledge that he has an infinite number of choices to believe in, and choosing to believe in the wrong one could spell certain eternal disaster for him. Now premises 2 and 3 will be examined. If God exists and you believe in him, you stand to gain an eternity of blissful existence in heaven, while if you disbelieve in him, you will be punished with an eternity of agony in hell. If God does not exist, you stand to lose little by believing in him, and you stand to gain little if you don't believe in him. In considering these premises, it will be assumed for the sake of argument that the faults of premise 1 have been bypassed, and a person has somehow stumbled onto the correct God to worship out of the infinite possibilities. These premises contain their own issues independent of the first, as they once again make short-sighted conclusions about what God is like. Pascal admits to metaphysical ignorance about the subject of God, thus why he does not try to argue for his existence. Quote, "If there is a God, he is infinitely beyond our comprehension, since, having neither parts nor limits, he bears no relation to ourselves." Blaise Pascal. Yet, he presumes that the rewards and punishments tied to belief are known. Even if it is granted that God does exist, it is not then valid to assume that that God will reward a person with infinite bliss if they believe in him or them, and punish them with eternal agony for disbelief. Why would it be a necessary characteristic of the omnipotent creator of the universe to offer such rewards and punishments to the Homo sapiens of Earth? Doling out such extremist forms of pleasure and pain to such a relatively ignorant and limited species does not seem to have much of a point for such a being. It is entirely possible that God exists but is a non-interventionist creator, leaving humans to their own devices and not particularly caring whether they believe in him or them or not. Pascal might argue against this by saying that even if a non-interventionist deity is possible, the chance that such a deity does give out eternal rewards and punishments for belief and disbelief still means that belief in the deity is the better option, and that it is rational to bet on the existence of the God who doles out the harshest punishments and the greatest rewards. However, this mindset is not necessarily without flaws. The idea seems ludicrous to a person brought up in Christendom, but Pascal is completely ignoring the valid possibility of a God who rewards non-belief rather than belief. When one stops to think about it, God is supposed to be an enlightened being, so why would God punish people who don't believe in him and reward people who do? He, she, they have not given any solid, compelling evidence for existence and have kept humanity in the dark, with humans fighting over sacred texts and superstitions, all the while scientific endeavors reveal more and more about the natural functioning of the world. Many believers admit to their belief on the basis of blind faith alone. It is not unreasonable to imagine a God who sees good humans as those who are skeptical non-believers and avoid religious convictions for a commitment to reason, and these humans are rewarded with eternal bliss due to their humility and not falling for superstition and making unfounded claims about God, without God providing compelling evidence. While on the other hand, God would punish believers with eternal torment for their arrogance and their lack of skepticism, making claims about God for which no evidence was provided. Perhaps the inconclusive strands of evidence left for the religions of the world are merely God's way of testing humans' critical thinking skills. In this scenario, Pascal's wager is turned on its head, and it can instead be argued that even if there is a small chance that this God exists, it is better to disbelieve in him or them than believe because of the possibility of an infinite reward for disbelief and an infinite punishment for belief. Something else must be considered too. If the infinite possibilities for God are once again taken into consideration, it must be said that while disbelief might risk someone losing out on their eternal reward, it might also act as a security against eternal punishment. The first commandment of the Holy Bible is, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," not "Thou shalt not disbelieve in me." If the correct God does reward belief with eternal bliss, then you might miss out on that if you disbelieve. However, that God might not feel the need to bestow eternal punishment on you just for disbelief, and you would simply cease to be after death. But if you did believe in God but worshipped the wrong God, then the real God might be so enraged that you chose to worship a God other than him or them, which would be consistent with God's self-admittedly jealous nature in the Bible, that they would subject you to eternal torment for worshipping false gods. If an episode of The Simpsons can deflate an argument, it probably isn't a very good one.
Tell it, Daddy.
And what if we pick the wrong religion? Every week we're just making God madder and madder.
Testify!
Premises 2 and 3 are flawed for yet another reason, however, which is that belief in God is not necessarily all that is needed to gain eternal reward and avoid eternal punishment. Blaise Pascal would have people believe that our wager only concerns the existence or non-existence of God, but looking to the different denominations of Christianity, it is true that some Christians believe that belief in God is all that is necessary to gain eternal salvation, but many Christians would disagree with that and say that one's actions, intentions, and obedience to God's laws factor in as well. A common objection given to Pascal's wager is that God would not truly be satisfied with someone's belief in him if it was founded on the basis of the selfish desire to avoid punishment and gain reward. God might look at a person who believes in him just in case as having a disingenuous and false faith. Truly believing in and loving God with all your heart is what he desires, and thus someone who believes in God for pragmatic reasons might be sent to eternity in hell just as assuredly as the atheist. Many Christians also claim that actions matter as well as beliefs, and so the serial killer who has a deathbed conversion to faith might also be sent to hell after death. Pascal might argue that simply acting righteously throughout one's life mixed with belief in God will be answered with eternal reward in heaven if he exists. But there are some Christians who would disagree with him again and say that regardless of one's faith in God, one's actions are the only things that matter if deciding if one will make it to heaven, rendering Pascal's original belief-based wager a moot point. On top of that, being righteous and acting good are incredibly vague statements, and it is showcased many times in the Bible that God has extremely stringent standards he wants believers to follow. In Mark 7, verses 13 to 14, Jesus states, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it." What these verses spell out is that a general benevolent life is not enough, and most who are secure in their belief in God will still perish anyway, because they do not have enough of a commitment to God's teachings. If this consideration is taken to its logical conclusion, then rather than merely betting on God's existence, it would be safest for a person who desires to gain eternal reward and escape eternal punishment to follow everything that the Bible says, including giving up all your money and possessions to the poor, and declining from wearing mixed fabrics. As it turns out, one does not necessarily stand to gain all merely by believing on God on its own. The conclusion of Pascal's wager, therefore, even if there is only a small chance that God exists, you are still much better off believing, is a valid conclusion because it naturally follows from the premises. However, it is not necessarily true because the premises it is based upon are not true and are full of holes. But some might say that Pascal's wager, as has been previously described, is merely a straw man argument, and was not what he originally meant. Any argument should always be steel-manned if its refutation is to have any credibility, and thus a different interpretation of Pascal's argument will now be considered. 1. If God exists, you are better off as a believer than as a non-believer. 2. Even if God doesn't exist, you are still better off as a believer than as a non-believer. 3. Therefore, you are better off as a believer, whether or not God exists, and so you should believe in God. This version of Pascal's wager essentially disregards the possibility of eternal reward or eternal punishment, and instead focuses on finite reward and finite punishment, and stands in stark contrast to the previously discussed interpretation of Pascal's wager, which argued that even if one's mortal life is worse off if they believe in God, it is worth it for a potentially infinite reward after death, and it instead argues that belief in God makes your life better in the here and now. Is this true? Are believers really better off than non-believers? Some psychological studies do showcase that religious believers are on average happier than non-believers. A 2019 study from the Pew Research Center, which studied 26 countries, found that on average, religious people, particularly actively religious people, tended to be happier, less likely to smoke and drink, more likely to be active community members and donate to charity, and more likely to vote than non-religious people by a statistically significant margin. However, this data can be misleading and is still somewhat inconclusive. For example, there are some studies that also show that people with strong atheistic views tend to be happier than people with weak or loose religious convictions. The security of the majority must also be taken into account. Studies show that religiously based happiness is much more prominent in countries and regions where religious adherence is much more prominent, while religion has a much lesser effect on one's happiness if they live in a region where religion is not seen as very important. This makes sense, as it is a well-established correlation that those belonging to racial and sexual minorities also tend to be more dissatisfied and prone to stress. Particularly in places where non-believers are looked down upon and theocracies where they are even oppressed and discriminated against, it would not be surprising to see non-religious people self-report as less happy than their religious neighbors. Individual differences between people must also be taken into account, as despite Christians' claims that belief in God and Jesus is the only way to gain peace and happiness in one's life, some people are simply more predisposed to find satisfaction in religious life than others. There are Christians who say that they were completely miserable before they gained a belief in God, and there are atheists who say the exact opposite and remark on how miserable they were when they were Christians. Undoubtedly, faith in God and Christianity can be a source of great happiness and fulfillment to some people, but to others it brings sexual guilt and repression, a traumatic fear of hell, and spiritual malaise. Pascal, like many believers, talks about non-believers as if there is something wrong with them and they have something missing in their lives. You want to cure yourselves of unbelief and ask for the remedies? There are people who know the road you want to follow and have been cured of the affliction of which you want to be cured. Blaise Pascal. But this is just flat-out insulting. Many non-believers live happy and fulfilled lives and would laugh at those who would tell them that they would be better off believing in God.
It's funny, when I was a devout Christian, I always thought I was free. Then I got out, and I realized now I'm free. I'd never go back into the matrix.
There is also the problem that this version of Pascal's wager does nothing to further Christianity's cause, as other religions can also be seen to produce the same positive effects of greater happiness seen in Christian followers. Buddhism, in particular, an atheistic religion, tends to showcase great benefits in terms of happiness in its adherents. In reality, it appears as though belief in God has nothing to do with happiness, but rather the sense of community that religion naturally provides is the key factor. As studies show, religious people who do not feel connected to their church community do not experience any happiness benefits on average, while non-believers who are connected to a secular humanist community do. But on top of that, while religious belief can have a net positive effect on an individual's life, one must also consider how religious belief affects society as a whole. The World Happiness Report of 2020 had the top 10 happiest countries ranked as Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, the Netherlands, Sweden, New Zealand, Austria, and Luxembourg. In all of these countries, Christianity is the biggest religious group, which seems to support Pascal's viewpoint, until one considers that these are also some of the least religious countries on earth, with on average a small minority of people saying that religion is very important in their lives. Countries where there are the smallest percent of religious adherents also tend to be the wealthiest and most educated, with the lowest levels of crime, income inequality, and government corruption. While the most religious societies, such as Afghanistan, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Haiti, and Ethiopia, not only rank the lowest on the World Happiness Report, but also tend to be the poorest and least educated, with the highest levels of crime, income inequality, and government corruption. So, it seems that religious belief may very well lead to greater happiness in individuals, but if you want to live in a good society, you should follow the atheists. Of course, these findings do not really prove that non-belief creates a happy society, no more than the psychological studies prove that belief produces individual happiness, because there is a far too complex web of interlocking sociological factors at play that is heavily tied in with economics. A good welfare state seems to be a far better indicator of societal well-being and happiness than religiosity, or lack thereof. If one thing is for certain, it is that the data is far too complex to conclusively support the idea that belief in God, Christianity, or general religious practice will give a person a greater life or improve society as a whole, especially when one considers the many negative aspects of belief in God. As stated before, according to the Bible, God requires far more than simple belief. Many religious denominations have extremely restricting rules like prohibitions on masturbation and sex, which can not only deprive religious observers of potentially pleasurable experiences, but also leads to negative feelings of guilt and shame for desiring such things. Christianity also regularly contributes to the unhappiness of members of the LGBTQ community, which is why they are much less likely to be Christians in the United States than the majority. It also must be considered if happiness is really the only metric that should be considered when determining quality of life. A person of the Amish faith might self-report as being happier than a non-religious person or even just a less religious person, but is that happiness worth being cut off from modern society and being raised in a cult that you are unable to leave because you have no education and no way of functioning outside of it? If a person is happier believing the falsehood that God created the world in 6 days rather than the truth that life evolved over billions of years due to evolution through natural selection, does that mean it is better for them to believe the falsehood? A religious philosopher must reckon with the fact that religion often stifles critical thinking in its adherents and consider if the greater freedom of thought that secularism can provide is a higher good than mere happiness. Overall, the positive effects of living a Christian life certainly seem to vary based on how one's religion is practiced, and what one believes God demands from them. In addition, although Christians often point to things like religiously based charity as evidence of Christianity's positive impact on the world, throughout history and in the modern day, religious belief can often be seen stifling societal progress and creating major problems, or at least contributing to them. Religious faith has been used as justification for horrible holy wars many times in the past, which is supported in the Bible by the horrifying holy wars of extermination waged by the Israelites against their enemies recorded in the Old Testament. Christianity has contributed to the censorship of scientific ideas, which can be justified by the Bible, which says that the wisdom of the world is foolish and all one needs is to trust in God. Christianity has consistently stood in the way of the advancement of women's rights, which can be justified in the Bible with passages like 1 Timothy 5:11-12. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission, and I do not permit a woman to teach, nor to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. Both the Old and New Testament also support slavery. Their Christian faith may have made the African slaves in America happier, but it also heavily bolstered the arguments of their Christian owners for why they should remain enslaved. Thus, the second premise, even if God doesn't exist, you are still better off as a believer than as a non-believer, does not hold up to scrutiny, whether looking at individuals or society as a whole. However, in addition to all the many glaring flaws in Pascal's wager, perhaps the biggest flaw of all is that the wager is utterly useless in what it is trying to set out to do. Blaise Pascal is trying to argue that people should believe in God, but people can't simply decide to believe, even if they wanted to. To take a page from Bertrand Russell, a person couldn't, for example, suddenly believe that a teapot was orbiting the sun between Earth and Mars, unless they had some kind of reason to. Actually making arguments for the orbiting teapot's existence, like saying that a teapot was taken up into the International Space Station but mysteriously vanished in 1999, for instance, might make a person believe or at least consider the existence of the orbiting teapot, but telling someone that it is in their best interest to believe that the teapot exists would not give them a compelling reason to believe in it at all. Arguments for God's existence, such as the cosmological argument and the argument from design, at least attempt to use reason to convince people of God's existence, but Pascal's wager does nothing of the sort, and so is completely useless in changing people's minds. A person can say they believe in God, they can go to church, take communion, say their prayers, read the Bible, even join the priesthood, but in the end they can't choose to believe in God because belief is not a choice. It's a conclusion based on how the brain processes stimulus and information. A person can't choose to believe in God any more than they can choose to believe in the teacup orbiting the Earth. As a response to this, Pascal says that if you don't believe, you should spend time around believers performing religious activities and services until you do believe. Learn from those who have been bound like you and who now wager all they have. Blaise Pascal. In other words, fake it till you make it. This strategy does not necessarily have no merit. Undoubtedly, there have been many people who have been converted to faith in God through sheer exposure, particularly people who have been raised from birth in a particular religion. But this tactic certainly doesn't work for everyone. Some people spend their entire lives steeped in religious practice, but simply cannot bring themselves to believe anymore because it doesn't make sense to them. For some, the more they learn about a religion and the deeper they familiarize themselves with its practices, the less sense it makes to them, and every church service, every Bible reading, every conversation with other believers just makes them more and more sure that what they are trying to convince themselves of isn't really true. The saying, the best way to become an atheist is to read the Bible, certainly has some truth to it in many cases. Particularly for people whose brains run more on logic than emotion, there is just no possible way the fake-it-till-you-make-it strategy will ever work for them if more compelling evidence for the Christian God is not presented. There are people who desperately want to believe and think that their lives would be so much better if they had faith in God and were religious, but they simply aren't able to bring themselves to believe because it doesn't make any sense to them. Pascal says that we must choose and that it is not optional to wager, but in reality this choice he presents is an impossible one, as belief is not a choice at all. This lack of choice in what one believes also pokes yet one more hole in the claim that whether or not God exists, you are better off as a believer. Many non-believers are former believers, and after removing themselves from religion, many people do see their lives as worse than before. However, when you actually ask them why this is, many of these former believers respond by saying that their religious upbringing left them completely incapable of functioning in secular society. One must ask if Christianity artificially creates unhappiness in non-believers by leaving former believers with the lack of an ability to cope with stressful situations through secular means, which certainly do exist. When a person says that without their faith in God they would be completely lost, this is a truly great condemnation of religious belief, as it robs people of the ability to use secular means of obtaining happiness, opening up a great risk of trauma and unhappiness if a person ever loses belief in God for reasons outside of their control. If wagering is truly the way to go, then one should perhaps wager that they might lose faith in God in the future, and so dedicate all their efforts to finding secular ways to live a good life. So whether or not you lose belief in the future, you will be secure in your well-being. In conclusion, Pascal's wager in both of its interpretations that have been examined here has many shortcomings that completely prevent it from being a sound method of argument for Christians and other believers in God. The first interpretation falsely claims that belief or disbelief in God is a binary choice applicable to the flipping of a coin, and makes the completely unfounded assumption that if God is real, belief results in ultimate reward and disbelief results in ultimate punishment. The second interpretation makes inconclusive claims about the greater happiness and fulfillment of religious individuals, and both interpretations suffer from being completely unconvincing to get non-believers to believe in the first place. However, the worst thing about Pascal's wager is how utterly at odds with the principles of philosophy it is from the so-called philosopher Blaise Pascal. At its core, philosophy is dedicated to finding truth not as a scientist would, through careful experimentation and testing, but through logical reasoning. And yet, Pascal in his wager is completely unconcerned with this, saying that reason has nothing to do with it. Quote, "Reason cannot make you choose one way or the other. Reason cannot make you defend either of the two choices." Blaise Pascal. It is true that with the evidence available to humans at the current date, no one can say with certainty that God exists or not, but philosophical arguments can still be used to argue for or against his/her/their existence. Philosophy is concerned with finding truth, it's just that many of the questions asked never get a definitive answer. With this in mind, it is simply ridiculous that Pascal claims in his writings that people's inability to believe arises from their passions, because reason urges them to believe, when he outright admits that he has no reasons to believe in God. It is only reasonable to believe in things for which there is reasonable evidence for, and in reality, Pascal is the one appealing to emotions and passions, telling people that they will get a reward if they do believe. When asking atheists why they don't believe in God or a religion, most respond by simply saying that they don't see the evidence and that it doesn't make any sense to them. But a large proportion of religious people outright admit that they believe in God purely for emotional reasons and it makes them feel secure. Ignorance may be bliss, but that doesn't mean it's not ignorance, and philosophy is supposed to help bring people out of ignorance, which Pascal's wager advocates for the exact opposite of.